quick comment. We talked about this all the time.
Turn our mics on here if we're going to do this on the record.
Yeah, so, is that true? Maybe it is. I just wanted to note that the Republic Services surcharge item was supposed to be on consent. It got noticed for a public hearing. You had a presentation, an extensive presentation at work session and prior discussions when the garbage franchise ordinance was passed. So the plan tonight is for staff to be here if any citizens do happen to come and want to testify or have questions, or if you do have questions, they'll be here to answer them, but there won't be any presentation.
So is it in consent? Oh, I'm sorry.
No, because it got noticed as a public hearing,
Okay.
we can't do it
Okay.
as consent. So
Gotcha.
that, just in case somebody wants to come and testify in the hearing, and if there are no questions, then you'll just vote.
Okay.
I did have one question about that. I think it's me. I don't know.
There's someone,
Is it?
someone buzzing,
Uh-huh.
someone feedbacking.
You want to just share mine?
Hello? I think this one is too. but-
Just the question
Packet.
about the timing of that. In the packet, it said that it would go into effect on January 1st. And I was trying to remember what we did initially when we had the recycling surcharge, how much lead time we gave to communicate that this change was coming to people, and if it made sense, I don't know if it does, but if it made sense to replicate that.
Yeah, so what had happened was when the recycling surcharge was passed, when the franchise agreement
Right.
was passed, then time was given, I think several months were given to, before it would go, well, it was said to go into effect in January. But they also wanted to have a second look at it
Okay.
before that happened, just to make sure the market hadn't changed. So this has been something that the public has been aware of for several months.
So it's really wrapped into this first one,
Yes.
which has been communicated for
Yes,
some time.
and so
Okay.
this was just
That makes
bringing it,
sense.
yeah, this was just, they thought it would make sense to bring it back after 6 months, just in case that changed. And apparently, there's been really no change in the markets at all, and so now they've determined to look at it again in a year.
Okay. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so any concerns for council on the front end here? All right. Well, why don't we move then into our first work session item on the electric bus art presentation. So who do we have? You need to light up your mic here. Speak for the record.
I'm not going to say much. I'm Philip Clark, and I represent Arts and Technology High School, but I think all of our students have a wonderful presentation, and I think they'll introduce the rest of us, so if that's all right.
So this is on TV, and if they're all not on a mic, it'll be on TV. Oh, you got a mic.
think we got a
Excellent.
mic over
All
there,
right.
yep.
All right, thank you.
Greetings, Mayor Knapp, City Councilors, and officers of the South Metro Area Regional Transit System. It is a pleasure to present to you today our designs for the Rapsa Smart's new fleet of electric buses that will hit Wilsonville's roads in early summer 2019. Please let me introduce the members of our team who are here today. Eleanor Carrick, Shatola Hart, Angelica Maldonado, Jaslyn Carr-Buller, Vianney Bautista, and Leilani Bautista, and myself, Alasia Gates. We are comprised of students from 2 Wilsonville schools in the Westland Wilsonville School District, Art Tech High School and Wilsonville High School. It was a pleasure to have this collaboration between the 2 schools, and we hope that we may have the opportunity to work together again in the future. You can see that our group was much larger when the commission was first given to us last winter. This photo was taken on the first day when we were given the tour of the Smart Headquarters campus, and the criteria and parameters of the commission were laid out for us.
Hello, my name is Eleanor. These are scenes from our tour of the bus yard and the automotive service facility, which included taking a close look at the existing smart bus fleet and noting the design elements that are part of the SMART trademark branding, which we see in both the regular fleet and the smaller fleet of biodiesel vehicles. Note the bare trees in the background of the lower left photo. This was a cold winter day. Following the tour, we retreated to the conference room at SMART headquarters to learn the specifics for our commission, the parameters within which our design would need to be confined. We, being fine art students, are down with design challenges. Bring it. This is what we were faced with. Our design needed to include the SMART company logo, SMART's tagline of Think Smart, Ride Smart, SMART's phone number, the address of SMART's website, a SMART nod to the project's funding sources, Wilsonville's city logo, a green theme, electric power, no emissions, sustainability, etc. And the constraints that our artwork could not cover any windows or vents, and that we could only use the colors from the very specific and limited Pantone color palette that SMART uses for its other buses.
I am Christopher Chatolhart. I'm standing in for my student Max McGuire, who could not be here this evening. For the next couple of months, we got together once a week, every Tuesday after school until 5 p.m., either at Art Tech or at Wilsonville. We brainstormed. We made lists and charts. We filled up 3 panels of whiteboard each session. We drew and drew and drew. We pinned our drawings to a bulletin board wall at the end of each session, and this wall was huge, and our drawings covered an area that was at least 4 feet wide and 10 feet wide. In March, we came here to City Hall to present a slideshow to the SMART staff of the highlights of our initial concept drawings. The admin team pored over these drawings and helped us narrow our focus. They liked 4 basic ideas that they wanted us to slam together. They liked the tree design and wondered if that tree could be the iconic tree at Graham Oaks. They liked the references to electricity technology, the wind turbines, and the idea of an electric cord and plug. They basically wanted a continuous scene that wraps around the bus with farmland, woods, and Mount Hood slowly transitioning into the town of Wilsonville. They liked the watercolor style in the top left image in this slide and thought that could be a nice branding of the electric bus fleet, a fine art style, different from the graphic design look of the biodiesel fleet. We liked this idea too, because we're from the fine art program, not the graphic design program. So having a look that represents our discipline was right on.
They noticed that the city in the painting quotes iconic Portland architecture, so they challenged us to make the architecture references recognizably Wilsonville. They liked the layers of green and the use of atmospheric perspective to provide the illusion of depth. We gathered many reference images. Here we see some array of solar panels, wind turbines, and a study image for an electrical cord. Notice how we have started to translate these not into a grayscale, but into a smart green scale. We also made list of possible Wilsonville Township features that everyone would recognize as Wilsonville. We had a lot of debate about this because it's hard to find structures that really specify Wilsonville. We gathered many photographs of possible subjects. We finally settled on these: the library, the West Station clock tower, the iconic tree at Graham Oaks, the Old Beach store from Old Town, the Wilsonville Cinemas, a contemporary townhouse structure that we see in several of Wilsonville's neighborhood developments, the iconic railway bridge that runs parallel to the I-5 Boone Bridge crossing the Willamette, Wilsonville's Old Church, which is now part of the McMenamin Pub. Then we translated them into Greenscale.
My name is Jasleen. Now I was back to drawing and figuring out how these different iconic structures could be collaged together to form a continuous progressive scene that everyone would recognize as specifically Wilsonville. While these transition drawings were being designed, we also discussed utilizing a greenscale/grayscale gradient of values to help create a notion of spatial depth. We thought 4 distinct values would be effective. After the drawings of the continuous flow were basically finished, we went back and inserted our photographic models into the same formation of the drawing schematic. We thought that the Wilsonville imagery should fit within the smart bus arrow and wave graphics. In the same way that those arrows shift from light to medium to dark, our scenery should shift with the same sense of gradient.
I'm Vinay. This is how the scene should be placed on top of the arrow graphic. We thought that the architecture's rendered values should follow the value shift inherent in the Smarts brand arrow graphics. What you see here are Jasleen's watercolor paintings. Jasleen had done the initial watercolor paintings that the Smart administrators felt could define the fine art look and aesthetic for the electric bus fleet. Once the paintings were complete, we could begin to imagine the placement of the required text on top of the artwork. The text had to be designed compositionally as a design element, fitting into the artwork, sensitive to our notions of the interplay between positive and negative space. The electric cord being carried by the birds motif was one of the last additions to our design.
Hello, I'm Leilani. In these next few slides, we see the evolution of the back of the bus design, featuring the iconic oak tree and grandma oaks and some wind turbines. Here is Jasleen's translation into watercolor. Here is our text placement suggestion. Here we've added the birds carrying the electric cord. And here's where we think the artist names could be, with a note about the partnership between the city, SMART, and the Westland Wilsonville School District. We hope this brief glance into the story of our work has been helpful. We are grateful for this opportunity to speak with you and for the opportunity to create a piece of public art that will be visible in the rest of Wilsonville for many years to come. We have brought our original art here to show you today, so please take a moment to check it out and let us know if you have any questions. Thank you.
Wow. What a process and what a result. Council, any questions or perspectives you'd like to offer? Councilor Lehan?
Yes, I think it's fabulous. I really like especially the birds and the electric cord. That is so, who would think of that? But all of it really fits together, and it's just fabulous. I don't know what else to say. It's, and all those elements they described, the gradations and everything, I don't know how you could have implemented it better. So that would be my comment. I don't know, you go ahead.
I appreciated having the oak from Graham Oaks Park, because I think it's an asset of the community that we're all very proud of too. And I'm surprised and really excited at how cohesive the different structures work together. They, to have the clock tower and the library and the old church, the McMenamins, and it just, I think maybe it's the angles, kind of that reminiscent, of the roof lines and the clock tower, and then with Mount Hood too, to have that all kind of working together. I think it's really exciting, so really cool. Thank you. Yeah.
I also think that you all did a very good job, and I am really happy that instead of paying some consultant or artist from outside the city. Number one, just from a money standpoint, but number two, I don't know if we'd have got much better artwork if we had. This looks really, really good. I also want to commend you on your presentation. You did a very, very nice job. So great job there. And lastly, I would insist, if I were you all, that your names be very visible on the back of the bus. So you can say, you know, I had a part of that, because you should be proud of it. You did a really, really nice job.
Yeah, I certainly concur with all of that, and I don't think that we would ever go to an outside group and get something that so effectively pulled together all these recognizable images that really define being part of Wilsonville. So I just think that's an outstanding result. I think that the process you've been through is probably something that I would guess you learned something about how to integrate ideas into the drawing. So I'm very impressed, and I cannot wait to see the buses wandering around Wilsonville with that kind of imagery that is clearly our own Wilsonville imagery. So thank you so much. Well, the buses are supposed to be here in the spring. Simon, is that March? March-ish? Okay, and then we have to equip them and wrap them and everything, so take a little while.
By Pro Graphics? Gillespie.
Yeah.
A local.
So we'll have a local firm doing the transition into the wrap. All good stuff.
March, April?
No. May, June, probably, yeah, okay. All right, Council, would you like to look at the drawings close up?
Yes.
Shall we take a minute?
I might add a couple of thoughts. First of all, just how proud we all are of this group of students and how hardworking they were, and we really appreciate the detailed feedback and noticing things that really were part of the discussion of the design process for them. So thank you for noticing those things. The names will be prominent on the back of the bus. What you see on the middle easel is the print of our work with all of the graphics, how they will appear on the bus, and that vinyl is the exact glossy vinyl that Gillespie Graphics will do the printing on. And so those are true colors. We were excited to see how the watercolor paper and the watercolor pigments would translate onto the vinyl. And I am very proud of Jasleen for looking at the Pantone colors. She's such a colorist. Look how spot on her watercolor mixing of those colors. The inks on the vinyl, those are the Pantone inks that the printing company uses. Look how close she got with color mixing. Good job, Jasleen. Yes, please, Council, have a close look.
Have you come? Chris, nice to see you. Great job.
I'm going upstream. Okay, to Sam. Very well. Thank you so much. Yes. Behind him? Okay, do you want, okay. You want to talk Christopher? Hey, Christopher? We want to get a couple shots for the Lynchburg Messenger, so can you work with them to see? I'll just grab that, I'll grab that. Against the whiteboard? Want to go over there? That corner. Create like a scenescape or something. Scenescape. Put a scenescape right there. We could have them. Maybe we could create one. Actually, we could talk to them. Do a scenescape. You guys want to paint a mirror while you're there? All right. Yeah. So once they're done looking at it. Do a story. Follow up. Get a release. Use their picture. We have release. And we already have them. She does? Yeah. We have a release?
Yes. We're gonna get a quick picture so we can do an article for the Instagram Messenger. We'll do one with just the kids, and then maybe we'll do one with the council and the kids. We'll do one with just the kids, and then we'll do one with the council and the kids, okay?
That sounds great.
That's the partnership.
Yeah, for symmetry, why don't you get in the middle? And as close as you guys can all get together.
Go off that side a little bit so we can see the face.
The hard part. Holding a smile for the next. Say ice cream. Works for my daughter every time. Okay, I'll take a couple more. 1, 2. Great. Now we'll take some of the counselors. Let's put the council in there. You guys
Go ahead, stay
stay
there.
right
We'll
there.
get the council and kids. Yes. All guys in back.
When was the last time you stood in the front row of a photo? It's probably
Been a while.
basketball team.
Right here. Thank you. After you, sir.
So before you folks get away from us here, I would like to have the council just maybe give a kind of a formal consensus, if we could, on the work and how much we appreciate this and how excited we are. Is there anybody else that would like to say?
I would just say it's a very, very professional job and a very professional presentation.
Yeah.
And I think they all have bright careers ahead in
Oh, I sure hope so, yeah.
in this kind of work.
Yeah,
I was going to say graphics work, but I guess it's fine arts work.
It's fine arts work, yes, that's right. Let's be clear about that.
Did you want to say anything? I just want to make sure that I'm endorsing this too, so the council really can give the SMART folks the answer they're looking for to move forward on this.
Yes, absolutely. I think that the council is all on board. If SMART is on board, that this ought to move right ahead as fast as we can.
Yeah, and the goal would be to get it, to be able to at least christen some of these buses and get them rolling before the end of the school year, so we
Yep.
don't lose you to summer jobs and gone away, because we'd like to have you there to do the christening thing. So we'll try to light a fire under SMART and keep things going.
It won't take much.
And we're also afraid that once the buses hit the street, that some other bus company is going to be out here trying to recruit you to do their artwork, so, so we'd like to capture.
You should make business cards.
Yeah, they should hand out. That's right. Very good. Well, thank you all, and we'll look forward to the next step of seeing it actually on a bus here before long. Thank you.
Thank you. Follow that, Delora.
Oh, I know.
At least,
Andy bring his A game after the high school.
Yeah.
at least we're still talking trees here, huh?
That's what I said. There's a tree on the bus.
Yes, sticking with the tree theme.
Sticking with the tree thing.
Sure. So good evening. I'm Delora Kerber, Public Works Director.
And I'm Andrew Sheehan, the Asset Management Coordinator.
Yes. And we are, you want to pull up the, oops,
We out here.
it's going to be on the desktop somewhere. So just close out of this. Oh, there we go. Okay.
You're hiding in the corner.
Okay, and we're here this evening to talk to you about the street tree replacement / infill program, which is
council goal number 11, to promote a healthy forest. And one of the subtasks under that was to develop and implement a street tree replacement program. So as part of that,
we had interns, myself being one of them, go out and collect an inventory of all the street trees within the city of Wilsonville. And we collected information on 23,864 trees. And within that, there were 274 unique species. And that fell under 44 different taxonomic families. And then here's just some of the information we collected. The general health of the street trees, it's overall really good, 88% healthy. And then the breakdown was about 75% deciduous and about 23% coniferous, or even a couple palm trees.
So we have almost one tree for every citizen of this town.
Yeah, and that's not counting.
Street tree.
Yeah, that's not counting
Yeah.
park trees
Yeah.
or private
Wow.
property trees.
and likely there's more trees even now, since this survey was summer before last.
Yeah, I believe we completed it around this time last year.
Yeah.
So. And then here's just some of the taxonomic breakdown of the most common species and the most common families. Within that, maples, red maples were the most common species, and the maples are in the soapberry family, so lots of maples. And then as part of this, I created a recommended street tree list. So a list of trees. I created this using other local municipalities' street tree lists and did some research on, their growth rate, height, how much room you need. And then you've got fall coloration and whether or not they're Oregon native species.
And we coordinate this with community development and natural resources as well as parks to make sure it's a list that we would all be content with.
And then here is our overall canopy coverage. So we came in just over 24% canopy coverage for the city, and that's 1,176 acres. And then just below that, you'll see how we compare to other regional canopy coverages. So we're right around mid-range as far as coverages compared to other local municipalities.
So as we are moving forward, what we did is we broke the city up into 24 different categories of neighborhoods, and then we had others. And what we did is we looked at, first did an analysis, a high-level analysis of taking away all the non-plantable areas like sidewalks, paved areas, buildings, any element where you couldn't build a tree. We would also, or plant a tree, excuse me. We looked at the canopy of existing trees and assumed that you wouldn't want to plant a tree any closer than 30 feet to an existing tree because at maturity the canopies. Did that analysis, went through, and then came up with a high level of potential planting sites. And then we sat down with community development, public works and parks, and we started going through some areas where we knew that it didn't make sense. So at the end of the day, what we came down is the various neighborhoods, is within each of the various neighborhoods, what is the potential tree locations? Now, all of these tree locations have to be ground truth. So this is high level, and it would have to be ground truth. And then we also did an analysis of what is the canopy coverage within each of those parks, or I'm sorry, each of those neighborhoods. If there was a park in the neighborhood, we specifically excluded it, so it wouldn't skew the numbers. And the color code there is showing that percentage of canopy cover. The average is somewhere around the 25 to 30% range. And so we have many places that are well over the 30% range, many in between. And then you have the 0 to 20, and you'll notice that the wall canopy is really, it's 14%, I believe, or 16, I can't quite tell.
16.
Check my glasses. Anyway, 16%, but that is because of the immaturity of the trees. And so as the trees continue to mature and their canopy gets larger, then it'll, be a better canopy percentage. So overall, we're looking pretty well. And with this analysis, there's over 1,500 locations that potentially we could plant a tree. Now, again, we need to do the ground truth. Though we looked at potential conflict with our utilities, we did not do an analysis of potential conflict with other utilities. So there could be a gas line, there could be a power line, various things like that. So with that one. And so then what we did is for each of the 24 neighborhoods is we had a more zoomed in map of potential. These are some locations maybe additional trees could be planted. So, and then another analysis was, so in this particular neighborhood of Montebello, the existing canopy coverage is 30%. There's potentially 25 locations where we could plant another tree. And though what's kind of an interesting analysis is if you planted all of those trees and at maturity in 10 years, you would increase your coverage from 30% to 30.12%. So it's telling you that it's pretty high percentage of canopy cover already, even if you didn't add additional trees. All right. So as we were going through, we determined that we'll need to ground truth the potential locations. That has not been done. There would need to be contact with the adjacent property owners to get their buy-in because of our city code is the adjacent property owner is responsible for the care and maintenance of the tree. And coordinate tree planting events, and then also to do some follow-up with the homeowners on that. And with that, we realized that the Friends of Trees already does that exact element, or those tasks. The city of Wilsonville does already work with the Friends of Trees. In fact, they just had a tree planting event this last Saturday here in town. So we thought that they would be a great fit for us if we wanted to move forward with this program to engage with them. And I believe it was a set price of about $250 per tree. They would take care of the organization of the planting events, doing the follow-up, working with the homeowners, making sure that they were all in agreement that they would take care of the tree after it got planted in front of their property. So the next element was talking about how might we, if we want to move forward with this program, how would we fund it? We could pull money from the general fund and allocate it to this event, or we could look for grant opportunities. And one of the grant opportunities that we thought was just perfect fit would be the Metro Wilsonville Community Enhancement Grant, which the applications are due in January. And we thought it would be a great idea that we would do a sponsored project nomination for this and ask for about $25,000 in order to move forward with the program. So, I guess, and that brings us to where we are. Do you have any questions before we move into the next step?
Councilor Ackerville.
I had a question about.
Is your mic on?
Sorry. In our packet, there was some information, sorry.
Uh-oh.
It's just,
It's feedback.
just me. Okay.
It might be the laptop.
In our packet, there was some information about the canopy coverage versus other coverage, maybe, that was in the conclusion. And I was wondering if you could help me understand the difference, because I know, and as you presented, we're about 24% canopy coverage, right? But then in the packet, you talked about 32% of urban forest covering approximately 32% of overall city's area. And I didn't understand the difference. And I know it's probably just my lack of experience with this, but.
Sure. I believe that number included the parks.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
so that's what brings
Yeah.
us.
Yeah, the
to
24%
the
is
difference.
without parks.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay, that makes sense.
Sure.
And then one other question too, is kind of a detailed question that I was just curious about I really liked the graph that you had on the different colors of foliage and the size of the canopy and how far apart, what trees might be appropriate for spaces. I also noticed in our packet you had some information about sidewalk damage from street trees. And I was curious if, with the data, if we have kind of pinpointed which trees are creating the sidewalk damage, because as you said, some of that is
homeowners are responsible for care of the tree and in that area. So I wondered,
Sure.
do we have data when we're making recommendations to people, use this tree or that tree, or maybe these are trees that we want to have? Do we know what's damaging sidewalks?
I haven't done the actual like detailed analysis on that, but when we were out collecting the tree inventory, we did note sidewalk damage. So we can correlate that to the species of tree causing it. And just from my experience being out there, it's the big maples and oaks primarily that spread their roots and push the sidewalks up.
So more of driven by the age of the tree versus the type?
The type.
Age of
The
tree,
root system.
yeah, and just trees being planted in too small of a space.
Okay.
And that's where the ground tree theme would come in, is making sure that, that we're not causing further problems.
Yeah, okay.
But we do have an approved list of street trees that we work with PGE on, correct?
Well, we didn't work with PG specifically.
But they have an approved list.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we work with various City of Portland, City of Seattle.
Friends of trees too, okay.
Yeah, the main tree list, I use Portland tree list, Seattle, and actually PGE's tree list to create our tree list that was in the presentation.
Okay. So we have all this information now to make
Better
good
decisions.
recommendations and, moving forward. Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, part of it is that not all our street trees started out as street trees. So we have accommodated trees in the street right-of-way that way predated the street. And so then you end up with situations like the Kinsman Oak and the sidewalk that was built up over that big buttress route because it was there before the sidewalk. And there are several other examples around town where we've done that. In Daydream is one of them with those big, I don't know what they are.
Right.
Oh, yeah,
Cedars, I think.
Cedars or
Yeah.
something.
Yeah,
Sequoias,
Sequoia.
yeah. Yeah, obviously sequoia is not appropriate for a street tree. The thing will be as big as this room. But there they are, and so we do our best to accommodate them. So I had a couple of questions in terms of species, and one of the things that we had talked about when we were first doing the tree ordinance was collecting data for what worked and what didn't. I mean, in other words, when people were requesting a permit to take out a tree, we would want to know the kind it was and what the problem was with it, so that if it turned out we had a lot of people requesting to take out this particular tree, then it would clue us in that there's something the matter with this tree. Montebello had a lot of way too big trees, like sequoias, I don't know if that's, or cedars, or something in their front yard that became huge problems for not just the sidewalk, but their foundations and stuff like that. So that was an issue. And then the other thing is disease. And I know Parkwood Estates a few years ago had a problem with those purple plum, whatever they are. With the purple leaves.
Cherry plums.
Cherry plums, I don't know what they are. I don't know tree names very well. But, and a lot of them were diseased and they were dying and being taken out. But there were so many of them in there that then you end up with, kind of a bare-looking street or neighborhood. And so, then does that tree stay on the preferred list? Obviously, that was planted as a street tree and turned out to be not very good. Or at least the issue was raised of about the diversity. So do we put all the same tree on a street, and then you're vulnerable to some disease or bug or something that takes them all out? So I didn't see that kind of data in those charts, but doesn't mean that we don't have it in order to, as time goes along, continue to adapt our recommendations for street trees. And then my other comment is about bigness, about one of the tenets of tree planting, urban forest, is you put the biggest tree you can in a space that will take it. In other words, don't waste so many urban spaces are constrained, the space between the sidewalk and the street, that you have to have a very well-behaved and not too large a tree with roots that stay well-behaved in that space. But if you have a big space, you should not waste it by putting some, little lollipop tree in there.
Right.
You should go for a grand tree. And so that's the other thing in terms of ground truthing. And I could give you examples of places where we have a wimpy little tree in a space that could easily handle a grand tree, and it's a wasted opportunity. So that's, anyway, just another thought in terms of the kinds of things it's good to track in an urban forest program. But,
Yeah, and when I was putting together this list, I did take some of those things into account. Like those cherry plum trees, for example, aren't on there.
right, I
because
saw they weren't on there.
They have relatively short lifespans of about 20 years.
Yeah.
So you'll have them all die off at the same time. And diversity is definitely something we want to think about. I believe Portland doesn't allow people to plant maple trees currently because they have so many. And they're concerned that if something were to come along that affects that
Right.
species, could potentially wipe out a huge portion of their urban canopy. And then as far as what trees to put in the space.
Space available.
Yeah, it's just a matter of definitely like right tree for the right space. And on the street tree list, there is a recommended width for planting the trees. Give them room
Right.
to grow.
And of course,
I
people.
love big trees, so.
People usually, they pay attention to it when they have a constrained space to put
Yeah.
a small tree. They tend to not pay as much attention when they have a big space to be sure to put a big tree, because you have few opportunities in an urban setting to have a big space for healthy, large trees.
Definitely.
And then I had one other question,
go ahead.
which is about the list, when you said you have dead and failing trees. Is part of this program removal of such trees, or what's the process? Is there any assistance or help or neighborhoods working on that? Or for pruning, because I mean, any street you drive down, I can see trees that really need pruning that are in the public way, and I don't know what our follow-up is on that, that are either obstructing driver's vision or pedestrian, or they're hitting pedestrians in the head or whatever, and I don't know what the procedure is at the homeowner's level or the city's level to address trees that have either that kind of problem, which is a pruning problem, or they need to be taken out or something. Anyway, is that part of this program besides
well,
just planting?
So replacing a dead or dying tree can be part of this program. And when it comes to pruning, typically if it's something that is impacting sight distance of a sign or a signal or something like that, we would take care of. And then if there was something that were to be brought to our attention of something else that the homeowner need to do, we'd contact them about them. Yeah. Such as, I don't know if you remember just here on Town Center Loop, the infamous apple trees that every fall
Yes.
dropped all those apples. So the homeowners, I mean, it was their choice, but they actually did prune it back because we kept pointing out to them it was just making a big mess and people would have to walk through it and such, so. But anyway.
But the removal, the cost of removal, which can be in the thousands of dollars to remove the dead tree.
So if you had a pilot project for the neighborhood you were talking about with the dead trees, that could be part of the grant for Metro Enhancement. It could be tree removal.
Yeah.
Could be.
Exactly, could
Right.
be, yeah.
Otherwise, it's the responsibility of the adjacent property owner to remove the tree and to replant, correct?
Correct.
Okay.
That is correct, so. So next steps for this program?
We're not done yet here.
Oh, we're not done yet,
Yeah,
okay.
The mayor hasn't had a chance to comment.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I may be the only one around this table that has applied to the city for a construction permit and designed and planted trees. I've planted more than 24 trees in the last 20 years. They're not all working out, and I followed city guidance on what to do and pick varieties we're supposed to pick. The flowering pears are problematic in a sidewalk grate, and yet we've got a bunch of them because that's what the city recommended. And I don't see that reflected here. I see 7 or 8 varieties of pear, and it's not differentiated where those are appropriate or where they're not appropriate. I know of at least a couple, 3 instances around town where Bradford pears mature and tend to just decide to drop whole limbs that can be 5, 6, 8 inches in diameter, landing on the sidewalk because the tree doesn't want them anymore. I don't know how that works, but to me, that's not an appropriate tree for that kind of a situation. I'm worried about it not being reflected here. I know that flowering pears are raising sidewalks, not just maple trees, but maple trees are a serious problem. You walk around older Portland, there's huge problems with maple roots. There's more than 14 maples in here just scanning through. How do we call out where it's appropriate to put trees that are going to get to be as big and problematic as so many of those Portland maples are that I don't know which variety of, or which sub-variety of maple they are? Seems to me that we need to be much more intentional about some of this stuff, or we're just, feeling good now, but deferring it till later when it's going to be a problem. And in the 18 years since I first planted trees there, it's becoming a problem in some places because we did not have guidance that would have prevented that from happening. And it seems to me if we're putting this much effort into this, we need to do that. I also concur with Councilor Lehan. Getting the old tree out, planting a 2-inch diameter tree is nothing compared to trying to carve out the root system of, something that's 10, 20, 40 years old so that you've got a space in the right location again. That's a huge amount of work, and expense-wise, it's just very drastic. I know there's dead maples on Town Center Loop near the Sherry's. I know that we've got that showing up, and I don't think, to say it's the individual property's problem, in many cases is going to get no action whatsoever. So it seems to me that we need to figure out a program, a method, a set of guidance, something to facilitate and help people deal with this instead of just saying, hey, it's your problem, take care of it. Whatever that means, well, what do you do, It's, as, when our city was so young, we kept planting trees. That was the big problem, let's plant more trees. Well, now we're getting to the point where a lot of those are becoming problematic because we kind of planted indiscriminately. And I think we need to be much more cognizant and provide backup to people about how to deal with this, how to take care of them, how to prune them, how to make these choices. And I think that our local experience argues we need to figure out considerably better guidance on trees that are getting planted now.
Mayor, I think we're on the road to cognition, and this assessment that they've done gets us part of the way there. But
yeah, it's not right.
Mr. Namsu has something he could probably add to the conversation.
Yeah, the budget contains an urban forestry management plan. So it's a funded capital improvement project that we've got on the books. And the idea is that we take all of the data, and this is extensive data, and we move and choose a consultant who's an expert in these fields and go through and prepare a thoughtful document that becomes the management plan of the city's urban forest. So I think we've got a vehicle to get exactly at what you were speaking to, Mayor Knapp, as well as what Councilor Lehan was suggesting. Species come out all the time, so it's a constantly learning environment for us. We have nurseries down here, J. Frank Schmidt being one of the most notorious. They make new species. Every year we get pamphlets with the greatest of this and that, and it does this and it doesn't have that. And well, unfortunately, definitely, we try a lot of those things. And we buy into some of those
In 25
ideas.
years, you'll know.
Exactly. And then we find out in
That's
20
the
years that
problem. It takes a while.
it
Well,
wasn't what they said.
They have
and-
trees that are specifically planted in bioswales that remove heavy metals. I mean, there's
It's
some
pretty
really
incredible.
cool science around the.
But it doesn't always work out, and so that point is
Right.
really well taken. For example, Raywood ash, relatively new species of ash tree, was touted to be this tremendous purple leaf color in fall. Well, it has this really shallow root system, and everywhere that we have planted them in Wilsonville, they have blown down in high winds. So we have just, as a
Run
as
away
a
from
city,
ash
we have
trees.
just taken that off of the list. I try to communicate with the planners so that as they're looking at landscape plans as part of new development, we're thinking about these types of things. And the biggest one lately is ash trees. What do we do with ash? Because it's such a valuable species in the urban environment. However, we've got the emerald ash borer that is moving across the United States and is decimating ash at a very alarming rate. Some say continue to plant it because it's going to become a disease-resistant strain at some point. Don't give up on ash. Others are never going to plant another ash again. So these are deep policy considerations around important things that I think we're going to be able to take Andrew's great work. We'll be able to move, get that done. I spoke with Kerry today. He'll be project lead on that with a team of internal stakeholders. And we obviously, I think, can get at this stuff.
Yeah, well, I don't want to discount the work that you've done and the progress that we're making. I am very concerned that we put that into the larger context and start to recognize that as our city matures out, that we've got to kind of get ahead of some of these questions and we're not just in that first phase. I mean, we need to learn from our own experiences here in town and modify what we are recommending and how we do it. I am a little concerned at we've got varieties on here that I'm not sure we have vetted for long-term suitability.
I think that gets at what Mr. Namsu just
Yeah.
said. So this is just the beginning. We'll use the data that we have and we'll perfect it with more expertise as we go along. And it's a constant updating every year as we learn.
Oh, and the other thing we discussed at goal setting last year was, working with homeowners associations where we have one to work with, and kind of prioritizing neighborhoods for their issues, which are different depending on their age. Like I said, Montebello, being one of the oldest, had some of the, some of these too large trees in the front yard problems that were coming up early on. And then people ended up taking them out and not replacing them at all. And so Montebello was looking pretty barren there for a while. And, but each neighborhood has its own issues. Certainly Meadows is at that point where they have a lot of mature trees. And Meadows was one where a lot of effort was made to save all those, save as many Oregon white oak. And did a great job of saving a lot, both in the street environment and the backyards. So that's a different, and so does Park at Merrifield have a number of Oregon white oak. But each neighborhood, depending on its age, how long it's been there, has different issues that come along at 10 years or 20 years or whatever that we could address with the homeowners association so that they're aware as a neighborhood.
So that implies that we would put more investment in our resources into this project. Is the master approach you're talking about on for 19?
Yeah, it's budgeted now,
But-
so we can go now.
Okay.
So it's in this year's budget, this fiscal year's budget. It's $50,000.
It's tied into the council goal.
Yeah. So it would seem apropos to carry forward, and, I think that makes sense with this data that's fresh, and that we not just put it back on the shelf, and that we talk about how to get to that overall goal of how we do a better job with, giving guidance and assistance where needed and that kind of thing. I think using community enhancement is a very interesting idea. I think we have something in the range of $100,000 a year for community enhancement grants, so it would not take the entire amount, would leave room for some other grants and still enable to make a significant first step on this kind of a program if staff feels like they can get that together for the enhancement review.
We'll have some kind of a
So
grant.
are you talking about the urban forestry?
No. I'm talking about just
replacement.
implementing.
Okay.
Your 25,000.
Yeah.
Your recommendation.
Yeah.
I just want to say something that you said, just to make sure that you're getting clear communication. And that is, you've taken us a long way, and that's great data, but we just need to make sure that we use it, not just have it. And so a great example would be, to your point, Charlotte, I bought in the Meadows 24 years ago, and the thought process then was each section of the neighborhood would have the same exact tree. And my section of the neighborhood, I don't even know what the name of the tree is, but less than half of them are alive 24 years later. Way less than half of them. And it was just like, well, I don't want to make that mistake again. And I don't want to have another neighborhood make that mistake because they're like, oh, let's go with this one. So I think we just really need to make sure that we're using that to the best of our ability. So.
But overall, I don't want to sound entirely critical, but I think Wilsonville has a good urban forestry sense and has done a good job with neighborhoods and trying to get the, keep up to date with the best recommendations for developers in terms of street tree planting and encouraging, and certainly when Floyd was here, he would get replacement trees for people at practically at cost or free or something. When people came in for a tree removal permit, he'd make sure that they had options for a replacement tree if that was what seemed appropriate, so that we didn't have the Montebello issue where people take down a tree and then it's 20 years till anyone gets around to planting the replacement. But the other thing that makes our urban forest so and canopy so good is the high percentage of undergrounded utilities that keeps them from being butchered overhead. So Beckman is one of those where you can't help but notice, because you still got stuff in lines in the air, that the trees get short shrift there.
Yep.
But most of the rest of the city, because we don't have overhead wires in most of it, our canopy is really healthy compared to a lot of neighboring cities.
So now that we have distracted you for this many minutes, would you like to do your next step?
Yeah, so in relationship to the street tree replacement infill program is wanting to talk about the next step. So if we are to engage, well, first off is if we're going to use the Metro Wilsonville Community Enhancement Grant, assuming that we get the money from the grant, of which we'll apply, is that the money wouldn't be available until after July 1, which is fine, because talking with the Friends of Trees, they are currently all booked up for this planting season, so the next opportunity wouldn't occur until fall of 2019, which actually after the conversation with having the, having the conversation about the urban forest report coming up that we'll be working on, I think that'll meld nicely together to ensure that as we go forward that we are very thoughtful about the trees. So just wanting to kind of confirm with the council is that would be the timeline. Planting would be in fall of 2019. We'll pursue the community enhancement grants for $25,000. Wasn't sure if you had a particular top 10 neighborhoods out of the 24 you want us to pursue. And then our next step would be after acknowledgement of the grant is contracting with the Friends of Trees. So.
Comments? I think the methodology is sound. My immediate inclination would be to try to discern which neighborhoods are most neglected, most in need, have the longest standing deficiencies to try to prioritize. But I don't know what that means exactly without
Well, what we could do is refer back to this graphic where it shows where it says 0 to 20%. Now, Vilbois, we know it's immature, and that's
Right,
why
right. So-
they
so don't
they have
prioritize
set to
that
So,
yet, you
yes.
know? Right.
But, and then also Brenchley Estates, and then, the one that's kind of interesting is Renaissance at Canyon Creek. So they're down at 70%. We could potentially target them with 9 trees, and then kind of work our way up through the the light green and so on, kind of work backwards from the
Yeah.
lowest
Well, and-
canopy coverage to the highest.
Well, and looking at you had a chart in there of the dead and failing.
Right. Oh, yes,
to
target those.
Target
first.
neighborhoods
yeah.
that have a high percentage of those or higher numbers of dead and failing because
Right.
they'll need to be replaced sooner.
Yeah, like getting the old ones out. I assume we've got to get the old one out before you can have Friends of
Well, I
Trees
mean,
come in and
that's the
plant
thing.
one, right?
Yes.
I mean,
We've gotta-
That's not their deal, that,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I have a walnut that will need to come out in the next year or so that's failing.
You have a walnut
The bid
street
is-
tree?
No, not a street
Oh,
tree.
I was gonna say, whoa.
No, it's my own tree,
Oh, okay.
but it's failing. And the bid to take it out is $3,200.
Yes,
So,
That's not uncommon.
no.
no, I know. If you have a mature tree that you have to get out, and it's near buildings and things, it's a spendy proposition for a homeowner to take on.
Yeah.
So I guess what we're looking for is just concurrence from the council that we're heading the right direction, and we will keep on moving that way.
I think I'm
Yeah.
seeing
Yeah.
that, you
Okay.
know,
Excellent.
and the coordination with
Yes.
Mr. Namsu on that larger question, I think council's really bought into also.
All right.
Okay?
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Throw away your walnut.
What?
Don't throw away your
It-
The wood.
Oh, the wood.
The wood,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okey
Don't
dokey.
cut it up into firewood.
Walnut firewood.
It's an English walnut, not a black walnut. And I know some people like English,
There's still carvers that will,
like English
Yeah.
better than black, but
So before this next presentation gets started, this is a continuation of the presentation we received from Jonathan Kramer
Right.
a few weeks ago and his recommendation to get certain documents in order by the deadline. And this has been a big team effort from planning, legal, public works, IT, engineering. So the whole room of people have been working on this project. And so it's not the perfect result yet. It's still a work in progress, but it's where we need to be to get something passed before that deadline happens, to give us some level of protection, and then things will continue to evolve from there. So with that, I will let some of the staff members who have been working on the project present.
Sorry about that.
please, go ahead.
Thank you, Barbara, Mayor Knapp, members of the council, Chris Namsu, Community Development Director with the city. Our team tonight is comprised of Amanda Guile-Hinman, Assistant City Attorney, as well as Tally Cohen, who is our law clerk in the legal department. I want to give Tally a little shout out just because she has been able to do a lot of work on this project on behalf of an already pretty busy staff. So Tally's talent and her research in best practices across the United States and her reaching out to different communities, collecting and compiling a wide variety of information on our behalf has allowed us to relatively quickly sift through massive amounts of differing opinions on this topic. This has been quite challenging, as Barbara just pointed out. We're on a very steep learning curve with these FCC regulations, and basically I just wanted to thank Tally for her hard work because she's brought us forward to a point that we feel comfortable with the presentation that we've got tonight. So I appreciate that. And the purpose of our work session this evening is for council to consider 5G deployment, to consider the design standards that go along with 5G deployment citywide. And we have a variety of fees, including application review fees, technical design review fees, right-of-way access fees that will be a part of your package when we go to the public hearing. And we've also got revisions to the city's development code, section 4.800. These changes are necessitated by the FCC regulations. And basically, as you heard from Mr. Kramer and as we've talked about in prior work sessions, The FCC rules allow for deployment in the public right-of-way and come with a number of standards that we're going to cover in pretty good detail tonight. Just to go over the presentation, Amanda's going to briefly cover the declaratory ruling by the Federal Communication Commission. I'm going to talk about some suggested design standards, as well as what we believe to be appropriate deployments. I'll cover the fees as well as the code amendments. And then Tally's going to talk a little bit about the locational standards and give you some examples of some of the inappropriate deployments. And at the end, we should have plenty of time for questions and answers. So with that.
Thank you, Chris. Again, Amanda Guile-Hinman, Assistant City Attorney. I'm going to try to keep it very brief on the FCC ruling. The FCC ruling was adopted by the FCC on September 26, 2018, and it essentially did two things. The first thing it did was interpret two provisions of the Telecommunications Act of 1996. And those interpretations particularly affect our design standards and our review fees. The next thing it did was the FCC adopted new federal regulations, and that particularly gets at our shot clocks and what a small wireless facility actually is, so it defines it. The declaratory ruling must be followed by state and local jurisdictions, and these new regulations, as you are aware, become effective on January 14, 2019, which is why we're on such a short time frame. So getting to some of those limitations, the first one that I want to cover is particularly about the interpretations of the two provisions that I mentioned in the Telecommunications Act. What these two provisions, and you'll see the limitations that they describe, what they essentially get at is that cities are not allowed to, what the FCC has determined is materially inhibit a small wireless facility applicant from getting into our right-of-way. What this has done is actually changed a Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals opinion where the burden was on the provider to actually show that they had to have their facility in this particular location, and put that burden now on the cities or the local jurisdictions to show there's some reason why it can't be there. Otherwise, you need to allow it in the right-of-way. The next thing that they interpreted, the FCC interpreted, was on fees. And basically what the FCC said was your fees, city, need to be reflective of what your actual costs are. The FCC determined what we generally call as safe harbor fees, which are $100 per application fee per co-located small wireless facility. So a small wireless facility that's going to go on an existing pole. And the FCC said you can allow for up to 5 small wireless facilities per application, so a $500 fee. $1,000 application fee for a new small wireless facility pole, and a $270 per small wireless facility per year for use in the public right-of-way. Now, again, to reiterate, this does not mean that we are prohibited from charging additional or more than those amounts, and as you'll see from the staff report and from this presentation, staff is advising that we do charge more than those amounts, but they have to reflect the city's actual costs, and the staff have undertaken some efforts to make sure that we are collecting what the city actually incurs as part of our review of these applications, and also of having these facilities in our right-of-way. So getting to the design standards, again, this is part of the interpretation. Basically what the FCC says is that we have to be reasonable. We have to be no more burdensome than other types of infrastructure deployments. That's not limited to small wireless facilities. It's also other types of infrastructure that are in our right-of-way. And they have to be objective and published in advance. Now, that number 3 item is of particular importance, the published in advance. That's why we are pushing to get this done before the January 14th, 2019 deadline, because we have to have those standards, our design standards, in place before that time, and they have to be published for the applicants. Finally, the shot clocks. Now, this is under the new regulations that the FCC has imposed, and they are pretty cumbersome. The first is for any co-location. So if they're going to go on an existing pole or structure in the right-of-way, there's a 60-day review period. And there's no real clarification of what the 60 days means. So what we've been advised to interpret that as is from the day that an application comes in through all the review, any appeal process that we allow, everything basically needs to be done within the 60 days. For a small wireless facility on a new structure, it's 90 days, but the same same analysis applies. If there happens to be an application that has both types, a new structure and an existing structure, the FCC says you can apply the longer of the two. So you can apply the 90 days to all the facilities that are under one application. Now, what happens if we don't abide by these timeframes is it's not an automatic granting of the deployment. What it means is that there is a presumption created that we are materially inhibiting those facilities from being put in our right-of-way. What that means is there's essentially presumptive evidence that we're violating federal statutes, and the FCC has also said that that violation is subject to additional fines and penalties. So there's more harm there's more fines that we could face if we don't meet those deadlines. And so Chris is going to go into the suggested design standards for you.
Before you get there?
Yeah.
So if we were to rent a lot of our utility poles to the public for something before this kicks in, so the renters would say, oh, no, we have access to this pole, you can't have it, is that a way around it? Or does that then fly in the face of what you just said about the FCC saying, no, that you're just going to get more? I'm just figuring out a way that maybe we could creatively rent our utility poles before the small wireless facilities get there.
I think that if we could show that whatever the use was that we were renting it for somehow conflicts with what the small wireless facility is what that facility puts on our pole or puts within our pole, then we could say then there's no small wireless facility that can fit within that pole. But we'd have to be able to make that distinction, that there's something there that somehow prohibits them from being able to go in that pole.
Okay.
I think the other answer to that question is there's nothing in the law right now that states we have to rent our poles. So in other words, if we didn't want them on our poles, we have to let them be in the right-of-way, and then they would have to put up their own poles.
Yeah, and
I see.
And Chris is going to get into this, it's actually on this slide, that in the residential areas, for the most part, we're essentially saying they need to be on their own freestanding poles, not on one of our decorative poles.
Right. So a few of the key general requirements include the fact that we obviously need to maintain accessibility for handicapped individuals. So we have to make sure that the ADA laws are being met. We don't want to obstruct any pedestrian or vehicle travel or access. And we don't want to have any of the small wireless facilities on decorative street lights. And we list several specific types of lights. The Westbrook is the light that's found in the Villebois community. The downward pointing flat lensed light standard. So you could imagine having a bunch of appurtenances attached to a decorative light. It really is going to detract from the visual environment there. The Town and Country is a small lantern type of it's a lantern on top of the post, and it really doesn't lend itself very well to deployment of the 5G. And then the Acorn lights would be an example found along Boone's Ferry Row, the blue cobalt lights with the clear glass top on them. Those as well we didn't feel that any of those lent themselves to the deployment, and we would suggest, our recommendation is that we not allow it on those three specific design types. We would allow them on a shoebox style, which is it's a small box, and you can find those along French Prairie Road, for example, in Charbonneau. And Cobra headlights, which are found along all the city's arterials and collectors. And we have some design standards that are in your packet to show you there are vendors now that are producing essentially replacement poles. So they would come in and all the equipment is housed within the casing of the pole itself. So we imagine that there'll be a desire to remove a street light and put in a new street light that accommodates all of the equipment as well as the antenna arrays. And we've got some images that we can show you later in the presentation. We want all equipment, Mayor now.
So outright declining to allow those three specific types will have the net effect of them applying to put in more poles.
Correct. And then we have a spacing requirement of 250 feet from one
in
another.
residential areas only, which was one of my questions. Why not in commercial areas also?
I think it could be individual poles 250 feet anywhere.
Yeah.
Not currently drafted that way. Yeah.
So that would be an additional code change?
That's actually a design guideline change.
Okay.
Please go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Equipment, cables, and wire, we want inside the pole so that we don't have a bunch of things hanging down off of the pole attached in various ways. And we are giving a concession to wooden poles. That would be the only case where we would allow anything to be on the exterior of the pole. And then if a cabinet within a pole is utilized, we want to see a smooth transition between the top of the cabinet and the rest of the pole. And we'll show you a couple of examples of what that looks like in photos and in the CAD drawings.
Yeah, and you're probably going to get to this, but the mayor had asked me a question about the wooden poles in Old Town earlier.
Right.
And not encroaching more on the sidewalk, so I assume you'll cover that.
Correct. We came up with a modification to prohibit any kind of attachment to wooden poles in areas where you have an overlay zone. So areas like the Old Town overlay zone would be an easy fix where we could easily limit the attachment to wooden poles in historical districts or architectural districts. And that was our thought on the approach to the concern that was raised today.
And I'm just going to jump in real quick. Obviously, this is the design standards in particular are still evolving. The internal city team is still meeting. We have a meeting on Wednesday. So for the January 7th council meeting, what we will do is provide a red line of between what you guys are seeing today and what we're proposing on the 7th, so you can see the changes, such as the couple that you've referenced, Mayor Knapp.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So the antenna array themselves must be contained within something called a cantenna. It's a circular radome. It's essentially a shield for the antenna. It's a new term.
Antenna in a can.
It's an antenna in a can, yes, not to be confused with a cantina, which is
A lot more fun.
it's a lot more fun, for sure. So these are typically mounted to the top of the pole. And again, we don't want to see a big bulky thing on the top of the pole that doesn't have a smooth transition to the rest of the pole. So we have some dimensions for the base of the pole, and typically the poles themselves are about 9 inches. So again, smooth transition is all about kind of getting this to blend into the design of the poles that are out there. We can't have the wireless facilities damaging street trees or having to be cut or pruned in order to allow for transmittal of the technology. And we've added in the resolution that you'll be seeing for the public hearing that the design standards may be modified by the city engineer. And and we're anticipating that there will be the need to modify since we're rushing out with some things. We're trying to get ahead of the curve, but we think that there'll be some good feedback that is likely to come forward and things that we want to be responsive to. So rather than initiating an entirely new public process around those small modifications to the design standards, we would like to empower the city engineer to make those small modifications based on new technology, changes in the landscape, ideas that come forward. There's a lot of work that's going into this right now. We've also identified preferred locations from a most preferred to a least preferred, and basically suggesting that industrial zones is one of the areas where they would be more preferred. Arterials and collectors, where we have the Cobra headlights, is obviously a preference. Public facility zones, that one we may want to talk about. That includes things like, well, Memorial Park is in a public facility zone, schools are in public facility zones, so that may be one that maybe that one should drop or be looked at a little bit differently. And then coming down to the least preferred locations in the commercial areas, and you've got these exceptions where obviously you have housing in commercial and we have a subdivision in industrial, so that's why we've accepted residential areas within those zones. And then lastly, the residential zones themselves.
So does this law, if you're living in a neighborhood, does this law not protect someone from, a homeowner from a company coming in and digging up their front yard to lay lines in or anything like that? How does that work?
Right, so what the FCC has done only addresses facilities in the public right-of-way. So the private development, anything that happens on private property isn't addressed by the FCC. And actually, we have seen, not necessarily, I wouldn't necessarily call them small wireless facilities, but we have seen some applications come in for towers to be put on private buildings, have started to come into the planning department. So we've seen that starting to happen.
One other quick question. With Frog Pond coming in, are there any natural places that could house some of these so it doesn't make it look ugly as a neighborhood, since we're in the planning stages?
That's a really great idea, and I honestly I think when we do these master plans, we should be looking at that very issue. Out there, it's going to be even more challenging because there's a significant amount of rainwater that's being managed in the planting strip area. And we're proposing that you shouldn't be putting these poles within our low-impact development rainwater cells that are in the right-of-way. So if you look at the right-of-way, it's a street tree or it's a rainwater feature. It's leaving very few choices for these to be deployed in, given the standards. So it's definitely going to be a challenge in Frog Pond in a different way.
So if a homeowner wanted to lease their backyard for a facility, they can go ahead and do that? There's no design standards that would stop them from sticking one of these on the side of their chimney or?
So the design guidelines speak to the fact that we would use these as guidance for those private property deployments. The industry, as I understand it, and you know more than I, but they're really trying to get away from that individual private property situation because that's where they are now, right? They're on all this private property all over the United States, and it's incredibly expensive to have to pay the dues.
Pay rent.
Yeah, pay rent for perpetuity, and that's why the legislation has shifted to the public realm.
Yeah,
and to the right of way.
and then cut the
cut the fees right out. from
Right, and no ongoing rent. Just because our citizens own that street and have paid for it, they shouldn't be able to charge an ongoing fee, right? Yeah, I mean, that.
Because private property is charging them, what, $2,000 a month or something for a spot, and now they'll be limited to
So the
$200 a year?
The losers are the cities, those private property owners that used to get rent, and
Rent,
the
yeah.
winner is the wireless
Right,
provider.
the whole industry is headed that
But-
way.
Yeah, who's throwing money down at the US Capitol?
Yeah.
Well, the FCC
Exactly.
is
It's not city government.
full of
Yeah.
industry, so.
Yeah.
But Counselor Starr, to get to your point, I think, and to echo Chris's point, I think particularly as we master plan out our new industrial areas and at least with Frog Pond East and Frog Pond South, these have to be considered because your point's well taken. And, I mean, our 5G will be coming. Our citizens do want this service. I mean,
There is a public good involved.
there
as
is a
well.
public good involved in it, and, talking with Andy Stone, there's efforts to provide more fiber to our schools, because they need more fiber, and this is all interconnected, because you need the fiber for the wireless facility, so there is some public good in planning for this, but we
Between
just
the
have to do it the
hours
right
of
way.
3 PM and 7 PM, trying to get on your cell phone
Yeah.
near the Boones Ferry, Wilsonville Road intersection is almost impossible.
Right.
So when this
These would
whole
happen.
thing transitions into this, does that mean some of the giant ugly ones are coming down, will go away?
So those are still going to be the backbone, I believe. That's my understanding, because
Yeah.
these small feeders still
Feed into
relay to
that.
those, and they fill in within so that we can get a lot more data at the neighborhood level, a lot more, and that's what these little guys are doing. They're moving the data from the big towers into the neighborhoods and covering the neighborhoods much more like a blanket, so.
But the 5G is also going to be virtually mandatory for the autonomous vehicle conversion.
Absolutely. And smart cities technology, economic
All
development, all of
Yeah.
that is.
Yeah.
Yep. So we need to do it, we just need to do it the right way. That looks nice. and
So
simple.
some images, may I have the mouse, please? Just because it's easy to point with. So the image on the left is an image that came out of the Denver, Colorado area. This is the Cantenna. It's got a relatively smooth transition to the remainder of the pole. Here is the Cobra Head standard luminaire, and the equipment cabinet is located in the base of the light. And then what we're saying is we don't want to see a lot of large equipment above ground, that if it's not in the base of the light, it needs to be underneath the ground in a vault. So again, fairly clean looking, and we didn't see this as an aesthetic concern. It does make the street light taller, but that is also something that the law allows and speaks to, and we'll cover that in a moment. This image shows you a brand new light standard that's being put out by a company who's trying to get ahead of the curve here. This is a 7.5-foot equipment cabinet at the base of this pole, and this one shows at about 14.5 feet. Our design guidelines say inches, 14.5 inches. Our design guidelines say this should not be any wider than 16 inches. And then you'll notice up here the antenna array. The antenna stack is what it's called. It's within the pole so that there is no need to jut a cantenna on top of the pole. So this is a brand-new deployment. These are brand-new designs that have just come out on the market as a result of this technology.
Is anybody using that yet? This is brand new? Is it
Yeah, I have not seen any images of this, and I don't know that it's,
I'm not sure if it has been used, but Jonathan Kramer was the one who supplied this to us, so.
this is a freestanding pole. So again, we would expect the color of the post to be similar to the one that's found in the neighborhood. And even, you know, it could be that this needed to be fluted in order to match a fluted light standard. And then this is the Cantana again with all of the equipment down in the base, everything else underground. We have a wood post deployment, which is, this is a strand-mounted deployment. This is the antenna array. It is enclosed in a shroud, but it's hung from the wire. This one is the least aesthetically attractive of the, all of the ones that we are open to permitting. There are very few wooden poles in the community. Generally speaking, they're along Brown Road, and actually there'll be a project there. That's actually the last project on the urban renewal plan to redo all of that, and we can underground all those utilities at some point. So there also are provisions where if they go up on an overhead power line now and we underground, that they have to underground their equipment at their cost. The city doesn't have to do that for them. So this was one, maybe the council feels differently than staff on this one. There is a meter on the base of the pole. So generally speaking, these wood poles aren't very aesthetic to begin with, and we wanted to be accommodating, and if we could get away with having less or fewer in a residential area and allow some on a wooden pole, we thought that that was perhaps a reasonable trade-off.
So our rules say you have to have a disconnect available. What's to keep the nearest teenager from walking by and flipping the disconnect?
Yeah, I believe it's inside the container where you need some sort of a key to get into it in order to disconnect it. So if it's in the base of the light, I don't think you can just open that standard. I think you'd need to have Dolores access to be able to get in. Can you verify that?
Yeah, I can check it.
Thanks. Yeah.
So, as you said, if we end up putting that underground and they have to, does that mean that they make their own freestanding pole like the previous slide showed?
Right, depending what lights go back in place. If it were a Cobra head, perhaps
I
they
see.
could go in, or they could coordinate with us to put one of those other newer Cobra head designs along the road.
The way we've worded it now is that they would have to go through a whole new application process. So they would make a decision, do they want to put it up on a pole, or do they want to make their own pole, but they'd have to reapply all over again.
Yeah.
So the new Cobra heads that encase the new technology inside, those are being manufactured?
Yeah, this was a manufacturing brochure. It was like Philips, and several or three different companies were listed in this particular brochure that we received regarding these new poles.
Is the cost differential between a standard Cobra head versus one of these new ones, is there a big significant difference in the two?
I haven't done any cost estimating.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, because, I mean, if you're putting in a more expensive pole, who would pay for that, is what I would be.
Well, they would pay for the pole going in because it's their equipment.
Right, but if we're putting in a new arterial or collector street, we put in our own street lights, right? So if there's a cost differential and they want to put the new pole in, would this allow for that?
My understanding would be they would take down, if we approved it, they would take down one of our lights, that would become a surplus light that would have to be stored, I imagine, somewhere. And then they'd be paying to take down and put in our storage, and then they would come with their new light and install it all themselves.
Or conversely, if we're putting in a new street and we're putting in new street lights, we would coordinate with them and ask them?
We could coordinate with them to do that.
That's what I was asking.
Yeah, that
Okay.
makes a lot of sense. I mean, every fourth one could be
If
this
that's
new
the
technology or.
aesthetic that we prefer, that would make more sense for us to coordinate with them, right?
But who's the them?
Yeah, I was just going to say, one of the.
Who's the them? We've got
There's gonna be a lot
competing
of them.
companies, all of which will want a piece of this. And I thought one of the most alarming things in the prior presentation we had from the consultant was a corner where you had antennas from multiple carriers directly across the street from each other competing. And, you know, how
Right.
would a 250-foot prohibition eliminate that? How?
That's the way I envisioned it.
And
That's
that
the way I
seems to be,
envisioned it.
that seems to be the general standard that we've come across. I mean, Talon might
But
be
it
able to
says
speak to
not
it.
within 50 feet of an intersection, we don't have, I saw nothing that would eliminate across the street as long as they were both 50 feet out of the intersection.
250 feet away from each other.
Like a radius, right?
A radius.
That only applies in residential?
Yes, we're going to change that.
Okay.
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
So if one company came in and said, hey, we want to do this style of Cobra with the antenna or whatever, and then another company comes in and says, oh, we just want the standalone posts, we would potentially have both of them, as long as they're 250 feet apart, implemented in the same, along the same street or the same neighborhood, and we can't necessarily say, okay, do it all the same.
Yeah, I
If
don't-
if they're representing, with different companies.
Right.
That's how it is.
We could not mandate design-wise.
Yeah, I was thinking
that
if
they
it's
use
all
the
along
same
one
design.
street, do the
Right.
same.
I mean, we demand that developers use the same streetlight.
Right.
Yeah.
We can ask that question. I don't know that we can do that. But, we've heard already that there are 4 companies that are interested in deploying, and that number may quadruple over time, or it may become fewer, right? As we've seen with these large technology initiatives, the number, but we've also heard that certain companies are much more likely to go into willingly go into a smaller size
others will
pole.
fight it.
And others are going to want to fight it all the way to the
So
map,
we have
right?
to, I mean,
And that's, the thing is that each of these companies have their own manufacturers who are manufacturing these lights for them and their poles for them. And so one of the pieces of feedback that I got I talked to the Denver Public Works guy who runs this whole program for them, and basically what he said is, work with you'll find the companies that are all, then their manufacturers are all kind of in the same place, and then you're gonna have an outlier, and you can push that outlier because you can say,
All
here's
the
all,
others, right.
here's all the other ones that can do it within our parameters. Yeah.
All right, so we're going to move to some of the locational standards.
So hold on. Okay, so we basically touched most of everything I'm going to say, but specifically on the residential zone, we mentioned already that the poles have to be 250 feet away from each other. Our guidelines also suggest that we have all the poles to match aesthetically, the material of the pole, the color of the pole design as well, and they must match the nearest pole. In addition, we also want poles that are between houses to be at least 50 feet away from any curb, driveway, or other access points. These freestanding poles must also be located on corners or along property lines, as looks like it's been seen in the example right there. As for the second example, the streetscape, our guidelines are suggesting that we allow the freestanding poles to be within in alignment with planting strips and in alignment with existing trees. Our guidelines also make sure to note that we are not allowed to damage any trees that are nearby the poles. As for commercial zones, which is basically seen in the image right there, poles cannot be in front of storefront windows, primary walkways, entrances, or exits, and or placed in any way to impede deliveries to the businesses. And we'll also include the 250 feet away from other poles as well. Now going into the inappropriate deployments. As you can see, these are a lot different than the ones that we've shown you before, but as for the first 3, it's clearly visible that the equipment shrouds are on the sides, and we don't want to include that. We want them either to be within the pole or underground. As for the first 2, the antennas are at the top, and we are pushing for the cantenna to house the antennas to be in a cohesive way with the pole. And the last example is the antenna as well, that's clearly visible on the side of the pole. And we don't want that. We want that to be in the cantenna as well and to be perfectly aligned with the pole.
Now, the ones that I saw over the weekend in Selwood were most like the third one, but the box, there were like 2 boxes hanging there, and they were both ginormous. They were like bigger than that box, and there were 2 of them
Hanging on the pole?
on the pole. And the cantenna was probably twice that height, and it was black. And it was ugly.
Other than that, there was nothing wrong with it.
You did not make that sound attractive at all.
I should have stopped to take a picture.
I think that's a field trip.
So here's the large base.
Yeah.
Councilor Leon.
And there's no aesthetic transition between the base and the pole, which is what we're pushing for. And then I zoomed in on the right-hand side, which is very dangerous for pedestrians to walk into, which is why we want it to be cohesively aligned with the pole.
You'll notice the graffiti in the lower left, so it becomes
Yeah.
an area where vandalism can happen
Right,
as well.
but with poles in the walkway, I mean, that was a question I had with wood poles, but also in general, anytime you have a pole in a walkway, you want to suddenly make it 4 times as big diameter, so it overhangs the pedestrian way that much more, yeah.
And then as we mentioned with the wood poles, we want the equipment shroud to be hanging from the utility lines, and in this example, they're on the side of the pole, which is not aesthetically pleasing, so we're pushing for the equipment shrouds to be on the utility lines or underground.
So the application fees, our standard Class 1 application fee is $335. That is an existing fee that we use regularly for a wide variety of permits. The technical design review fee is $300 times the number of locations within the application. And then we would keep track of our time, and we would refund or we would bill additional based on the actual cost to review, including any outside consultants that the city may need in order to understand things like wind load or snow load or other structural calculations needed to ensure that the poles are safe for the public. And then a right-of-way lease fee, which would be needed in order to utilize the city's right-of-way. There would be a lease agreement, and then that is where there is some room for some flexibility and negotiation in the fees. The statute does not cover that particular fee.
Right. Well, what we thought about here was each deployment is going to present unique issues, whether it's in a hardscape or it's in, some type of soft surface. If it's in a major arterial where there might be issues with cleanup by Public Works or by our street sweepers or anything like that. Like, we want to make sure that every single deployment has a number that's reflective of its actual cost. And at this point in time, given the short amount of time, there's no way for us to come up with a right-of-way fee for all deployments. So on the advice of our consultant, we're going to leave it as, we're going to state it in the lease agreement and do an analysis for each one.
Next slide, please. And this is what the fee structure would look like with the number of deployments in one application, the maximum being 5. So an application would cost anywhere from $635 to $1,835, depending on the number of sites, of actual antennas sites that were being proposed. So the 2 key changes to section 4.800 of the city's development code regard the fact that currently today we had a class 2 notification for all of these facilities. The reduced timelines that are articulated in the shot clock mean that we do not have the time to conduct a class 2 review and provide public notification on all of these things. We have to review these internally for completeness, and we need to get to issuing permits for these. So we've moved it from class 2 to a class 1, which is essentially a ministerial task. It's an over-the-counter type of a permit. And there's some changes to the height limitations to be consistent with the FCC's definition of small wireless. They would allow for mounting on structures 50 feet or less in height, including the antenna. And they would allow for mounting on structures no more than 10% taller than other adjacent structures. So you'd have to have something pretty tall out there. And you can go 10% above whatever is out there in order to accommodate the deployment. And do not extend existing structures on which the small wireless facility is located to a height of more than 50 feet or by more than 10%, whichever is greater. So there's not a lot of things out in the right-of-way that are 50 feet today. Standard Cobra head is 35 feet, to give you an example. So 10% of 35, another 3.5 feet on top of standard Cobra head is really what we'd be talking about. I think the wood poles may be the tallest thing that are in the right-of-way. So under a wood pole scenario, if you're on top of that and it were 50 feet, you can get to 55 feet, nothing higher than 55 feet anywhere in the right-of-way.
So the next steps, as the council's aware, on January 7th, we're basically doing 2 processes. There's going to be a resolution to cover the fees and design standards, and then an ordinance to cover the amendments to the code. So we're going, on the January 7th meeting, we're going to have a resolution on the fees and design standards and the first reading on the ordinance to amend the code. Then on January 24th, we're going to have the second reading on the, to amend the code, and we're going to be asking the council to declare an emergency to make the amendments effective on January 24th. And as this process gets underway, we're obviously going to begin engaging with providers regarding the deployments and the new city requirements. Providers are already reaching out, so, yeah.
Okay, we're getting short on time here. Design standard sub 212. The city encourages small wireless facilities to be installed in the following horizontal locational order. How do you encourage and not require? What does encourage mean? Same sequence sub 18. Applicant must assure that a clear, simple, and accessible disconnect is provided. Okay. If the disconnect is not easy and accessible, the provider will, so you're requiring them to do something, but then if they don't do it, you've got an alternative method of compliance. I'm not sure that that's what the message we want to send.
We can address that.
But take a look at it.
And I just wanted to clarify for 12, there has been an update to that number
Okay.
that we will,
Okay.
we can do, but we will make sure.
I'm losing track of the thing. Wood pole requirements goes into freestanding on page 6, page 7. That's where the 250, the freestanding poles in residential areas. I would ask you to look at both number 2, which is the 250 feet, and number 3, which is an aesthetic requirement, and why those would not also be suitable for this following section in commercial areas. I don't see how those are not as equally as desirable in the commercial area.
Okay.
And then the question about poles in sidewalks that we've talked about a little bit, whether it's a wood pole or a metal pole, or how you preserve the pedestrian realm there without it being impinged upon considerably.
So I would just add, as the mayor's looking through his comments, that this is a lot of material, and we do have the next couple weeks to refine these design standards. So if you have some thoughts, just shoot emails to us, and then we can do a red line and incorporate those ideas, including the ones that the mayor is raising right now.
So this is this is all about the right-of-way, right?
Correct.
If, because they don't want to be in private, on private property, can we require them to be on our property? I mean,
Not on
is our property like the right-of-way? I mean, as long as we're not charging them any more
These
than they would.
regulations only regulate our property.
Right. When the FCC was first undertaking this process, there was a question about whether they would include government buildings as part of that, government buildings plus right-of-way, but they limited it to right-of-way. So right now, the FCC doesn't require that, and we haven't undertaken that as part of this, but if the council's interested in offering city buildings as part of this, then we could explore
But
that.
then they would be right back in the same situation that they are with private property owners, right? They would be paying a lease.
Right, we
Well,
wouldn't have the regulations
no,
with regard to actual cost versus market rate, so that would be nice.
No, I mean, I'm just saying, if we would rather they put their thing up on the roof of City
Right,
Hall
yeah.
instead of a big ugly pole out in front of City Hall,
Yes.
why couldn't we can't charge them any more than we'd charge them for the
Right.
thing there,
Otherwise, it
Eliminate a
the
would be a
pole, but we
disincentive.
just wouldn't have the pole, it'd be up there on the roof.
So the existing code, the wireless section of the code prefers, it has in order of preference, city, Wilsonville property, including right-of-way. So it is an option under the existing code today to go on top of
To
the building.
prefer, yeah, that we would, it's like the co-locating requirements that we
Right.
had before was, if possible, you were supposed to co-locate and we own a lot of property.
Right.
We
We
do.
have a number of
And
buildings.
they really like the well site on the north end of town where the reservoirs are, because it's the
Nice.
highest point
Higher
in town, and
point.
we have 50-foot structures up there, so that's a popular place for inquiry.
Yeah.
The provision for accessory building size, which is on page J8, chapter 4, you're going to have accessory buildings 12 feet high as long as they're not on the public right-of-way? That seems like a pretty significant building. F. So no buildings in the right-of-way, but if it's outside the right-of-way, they can build a 12-foot-high building to put their stuff in.
We'll take a look at that.
I have a hard time envisioning quite what that is, you know, if they're going to be renting street front space from somebody just inside the line and throw up a 12-foot building in order to.
Right. You got to think of all these crazy permutations on this.
Yeah. That's enough for now.
So again, if anybody has additional thoughts, we can incorporate those into the next reading, and that would be a resolution, so that takes effect immediately, so that would take effect at the next meeting. Main thing is to get our design standards written, passed, and published, so that before that deadline date, so that we don't get stuck accepting something we don't want because we haven't done our
action.
homework. Exactly.
And
So,
as-
and that's been a strategy with other cities, is for providers to come in and complain, and then the councils to send staff back out and say, see if you can work with them. Unfortunately, we don't have that time. That doesn't mean we can't work with providers going forward, but we've got to get something in place, and we can't
But
go
that
with that
might be just a
ploy.
tactic to keep you from passing something
Exactly.
before
Right.
the deadline.
Yep.
you know?
That is a tactic, so.
So right now, for January 7th, we do have tentatively scheduled another work session if council feels it's necessary to go over the design standards again. So I open up that to the council to determine whether we keep that on the council agenda or
I
not.
think you want to have a brief time to go over the changes that you make.
Okay.
Just the changes.
We can do that.
Because then if there's a change that's not liked in between work session and regular session, you can hurriedly fix that.
And our legal team, I thought, very thoughtfully inserted a paragraph about if any court invalidates any of these FCC requirements, that it back sets our requirements, you know, I mean, so that we don't get caught, you know, having a requirement that we're no longer required to have.
Yeah, it's going to be an evolution, so we'll try to keep evolving. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys for the work on that. Exciting stuff, huh?
Thank you, Tally.
Good luck.
Yes, thank you.
Anything else for council? If not, we're about timed out, so we'll meet again downstairs. We'll adjourn at 7:03.